Hi there and welcome to the sew-along video. So the fabric we're working with today is a woven fabric, and this is designed as a summer garment. I'm going to sew this in a polyester chiffon, and a lot of you will go, oh no, chiffon, but chiffon's actually not too bad to deal with as long as you use the golden rule, which is to buy an expensive chiffon. When you buy cheap polyester chiffons, sometimes the fibers just don't sit right and they're really hard and slippery. So if you want to use a chiffon for this garment, by all means go ahead and do it. Just make sure you buy a more expensive one from a reputable supplier. Of course, you could also sew this in a polycotton, a rayon. You're just really looking for anything that has nice flow and is really light. So we're sewing a garment that's kimono style sleeves, and the sleeves are all in one with the body. And there's multiple options with regards to the hemline on this garment. You could sew it as a straight hem or a curve hem. Because a straight hem is so obvious, I'm not going to show you how to do that. I'll show you how to deal with the curve hem. It has drawstring and elastic in the front and the back, but of course, because it's your own garment, you can choose to use no drawstrings or no gathering. You could have this as just like a nice sack type dress, throw on, cover up, or you could have it as a more fitted garment, in which case the drawstrings and the elastic are quite nice to give a bit of detail to the body, but it's entirely up to you. Whatever options you want to do are fine. So you are going to need cord if you want to sew the version with the cord on the front. I'm simply going to use a bit of self fabric for that with knotted ends, but you can buy cord ends. You could even use something like a shoelace cut in half. That would give you a nice effect too. Right, so when you're ready, let's get started. And we're mainly going to be using the plain sewing machine, so make sure your colours match top and bottom. Check your tensions really carefully. You want to make sure you've test stitched on spare fabric before you begin, and our stitch length needs to be 20/5, a nice decent size. Don't have the stitches too close together. The other thing is, when we're going to finish the seams with our overlocker, we only need to use 3 threads on our overlocker. I tend to, if I'm doing a 3 thread, I'll use the left needle and then the 2 bottom loopers, but I often, especially with garments like this, I just continue to use 4 threads because I like the look of it. But certainly you only need 3 threads to complete this garment. So let's get started. Okay, so today we're going to start with sewing the channel, and if you look down the channel piece in the center, there's a small notch. Now that's to help us match these pieces together, and it's also to help with placement on our garment. Now place these pieces right sides together, and we're going to sew around this with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, which is 3/8 of an inch, leaving a gap around about here for turning it through. So when we leave gaps, we never leave gaps at the corner because it makes it too hard to get a nice corner. Now the other thing is, normally when we're sewing something like this, we would only leave a 6mm, which is 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. But just because of the nature of this fabric and also the other types of fabrics that you may sew with, 1 centimeter will give us more room in case the constant pulling of the elastic starts to degrade any of the seams. So 1 centimeter gives us a little bit more leeway there. So when you're ready, just come in from the edge, maybe an inch. Actually no, we're going to come in from, I'm going to leave it from the edge. We want to come in maybe 2 or 3 inches and start sewing. Is that going to be enough? Let's have a look. Now come down a little bit more, maybe 4 inches, 10 centimeters from the edge. So just before the notch, so we'll leave a gap up here, and we'll start by back tacking just to secure that, and we're going to sew all the way to the other edge, stopping 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch short. So when we stop here, stop with the needle down in your work, lift your presser foot, turn and pivot. Rearrange your work so we have a nice sharp right angle there. Do the same thing to here, stop 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch before the edge, and as you can tell here, because I've had a bit of a cutting error, I can actually make up for that error with my stitching. So lift, turn and pivot all the way back again to the other side. Stop here with your needle down, lift, turn and pivot. Lift, turn and pivot. And now we only need to go forward maybe an inch, which is 2.5 centimetres, and then just back tack to finish. Right, so this is what we should be left with, a big area for turning. So go ahead and do exactly the same for the other channel piece. And if you prefer to clip your corners, you can snip your corners across like that. I don't like doing that, but a lot of people do. What we're going to do now is just turn this through, and then we'll go to the iron and press it. So when you've pressed these, this is what it should look like. You should have the ends nicely pushed out. And with regards to the opening, you need to press it, as you can tell here with the seam allowance, so you can't actually tell where the opening is. Right, and the other thing about them is hopefully if you're using a sheer enough fabric, you should be able to see the notch in the middle. It's not essential. If you are concerned about finding that center point again, all you need to do is just fold these in half and then mark this with either chalk or a pin so you know where the center is, like so. And I'll go ahead and do that. And also at this stage you can have a look at them and just decide if one side looks better. When we iron them, we need to make sure we push the seam all the way to the edge. So we go like this to make sure that that seam's all the way on the edge. And so sometimes you just end up with the better side, the side you pressed on rather than the underside. Alright, so when you're ready, now let's go work on the elastic. So with regards to our elastic, I've said 1 to 1.5 centimetres wide, which is 3/8 of an inch to 9/16 of an inch wide. But the reality is, as long as it will fit within this width here and give you some extra room either side, the width of the elastic is fine. So what we need to do is take your elastic and we need to cut one length 15 centimetres, and 15 centimetres is 6 inches, and that's our cut length. So just measure that up and cut. And then we need to cut another length 11 centimetres, and 11 centimetres is 4.5 inches. So next, take the cording that you want to use. Now I've just run some tape cut on the straight grain through my binder, and that would be fine. Or I mentioned earlier you could go to, say, a dollar shop and buy shoelaces, which is a really good idea. And it's nice because they've got the bound ends. And you can also go to haberdashery shops and buy end caps if you want. However, if you're going to sell any garments made from this, you might come into compliance testing with regards to end caps. Anyway, that's another story. So I've set a suggested length of 80 centimetres. That's up to you. You can change the length if you find that fine. And all we need to do is cut this cording in half. So just match the ends and we're going to cut it in half. And what I'm going to do is just put a small knot in the end. You can do it later. Right. So we're going to start working with the front one, which is the shorter piece of elastic. So take the back one and put that away somewhere safe. and take the short piece of elastic. So now what I'm going to do is just sew on the cording to either side of this. Now I like to have it so that when I sew it, if there's a seam, that the stitching is all on the same side, and as you can tell this has a fold on this edge. So all I'm going to do is just overlap it by 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch. And I'm going to secure this. Now you could secure this with a zigzag stitch as well. Just make sure whatever you do, it's going to be nice and firm. And I'll do that on the other side as well. So I'm just running a little edge stitch, and this will of course depending on which type of cord you're using. Right. Now I'm going to take my other side. Just going to make sure that my edges are the same. Overlap it and stitch down. Now this will have quite a bit of tension on it, so just be careful that you secure this well. Okay, so just tidy up any stray threads. And our cording, draw cord for our front is almost ready to go. So now let's sew the front channel to the front piece. So take your front piece and you'll know it's the front because the neckline is deeper and there's a single notch directly in the center of the neck here. So place that right side up and we're going to sew the channels. So I'll just mark our drill holes with a pin. Now you will have either drilled them or you may have chalked them. I'll just put a pin in so you can see them a little bit easier. So the channel runs parallel to the floor. And here is one of our channel pieces. So just decide which way up you want the opening to be. If it's more obvious, make sure you've got this sitting the best way around. So the placement for this piece is at the drill holes. So this is why I said maybe mark the center if you can't see the drill hole there, because we have a drill hole in the center of our garment, so it's the middle drill hole, and that's going to sit right in the middle like that. And then on either side we're also going to have another drill hole. So the drill holes are marked in the key as being 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch in from the finished position. What does that mean? So that means if you came to your channel and measured 1 centimetre in from the end, which is 3/8 of an inch, that point there, and don't worry about the side to side, it's from the end, that point there needs to sit on top of the drill hole that you've marked in your pattern. So let's just do that now. I'll take that away and we'll pop the pin on top like that. So that's the beginning point, or one of the side points for that channel there. And then in the middle, that point there, so the center of the middle there, will sit on the drill hole position there. And then the other side of it, you guessed it, we're going to measure in 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch in the centre, and that position there will go on top of the drill hole there. Now, funny thing is when you're working with chiffons and any sort of light fabrics, these markings can move, just like they move with knits. So, the rule of thumb is you're better off making sure this is going to sit nice and flat than making sure the drill hole is in the perfect position, especially if you're using a light fabric, it can move around. So as long as this covers, the channel piece covers those drill holes, and it looks straight when you sew it side to side, it'll be fine. So I can already tell that my center one has pushed slightly upwards, so this is curving in an arc towards the neckline. But because I know it's in the center, all I'm going to do is just readjust it and pin it back, and then just eyeball it really, and just to make sure that this is nice and straight. So when you're happy that is in the correct position, we're going to edge stitch this down. So we're going to edge stitch it on both the top edge and the bottom edge. Now, edge stitching it, it's really just in from the edge. It's probably 1 to 2 millimeters, which is, well, I'm guessing it would be like 1/16 of an inch in. We're literally just sewing on the edge. The main thing is here is make sure you back tack this properly to secure it. Now once you've sewn one in place, the other is a little bit easier, and of course you don't need the pins then. So I'm going to turn this around, and in the process of edge stitching this, we're covering our channel opening hole. So now let's sew the back channel in place exactly the same way. Come to the back piece, and you'll know it's the back because it has 2 notches in the neckline, and take your channel piece and place it on top of the back, and the back is right side up, and find those drill holes. Okay, so now take the longer piece of elastic and take a thread turner and pop it through and catch that onto one end of the elastic and draw that through. Or of course you could use a safety pin or something like to draw that through. Okay, so what we're going to do now is secure one end of the elastic. So we don't want to pull it through all the way, we just want to pull it part way. So I want this elastic to come in here, and I want the edge of it to be hidden, so it needs to come far enough in that we're hiding it, so just in from the edge again. So I'm going to sew 2 lines of stitching to secure this elastic. The first, so make sure this elastic is in so you can't see the raw ends of it. So the first is an edge stitch, which probably won't touch the elastic, If it does, that's great. If it doesn't, that's fine too. So I'm just going to edge stitch it from side to side to close off our channel. And now our second line of stitching needs to be foot width, which is 5mm or near enough to 1/4 inch in from the first. You could of course make this up to 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 inch. And that line of stitching does need to secure the elastic. So when you pull it now, it should be nice and firm in there. So the first one is really just to tidy the end up, and the second one is to hold the elastic in place. Right, so turn this around. We need to do the same thing on the other end. We're going to draw the elastic through, make sure it is still flat. You don't want to twist it, and bring it through to the other end. Now this can be a bit tricky if you need to pin this in place. So make sure the edge of that is just in, and if you need to, just pin it. Well, the other thing I should have mentioned is the elastic needs to sit in the middle. Right, so we're going to sew an edge stitch. With a back tack each edge, and then whatever width we sewed in, sew in on this side. So I did foot width, and I'll just do that again, and make sure you catch the elastic and back tack, and trim any stray threads, and remove any pins if you have them. And then you can adjust the gather. So as I mentioned, these channels are entirely optional. They do give you a nice shape instead of it being a shapeless garment, but you might prefer it to be a shapeless garment. But it does give you stretch there, so it gives you room to move. Alright, let's move on. So now let's work on our overlock tidying. So take the back piece, the piece that you were just working on, and with right side up, we're going to overlock the straight edge, which is the edge of the armhole. And all we're going to do, and as I mentioned, you only need 3 threads, but I'm going to use 4, is we're going to overlock tidy the armhole area. Now this is to bind the edge. If you prefer, you could turn under 1 centimetre and then stitch at the suggested hem width. I'm just going to overlock. The overlock blade is not to cut any of the fabric off. This pattern is designed so that with the overlock blade, we're just going to tidy off those stray threads on the edge. Alright, now continuing down that curve, which is the side seam, you will find a notch. Now you'll have the notch here in both the straight hem garment and the curve hem garment. So the procedure is the same no matter which version you're sewing. Starting around about 2 inches, which is 5 centimeters above the side seam notch, we're going to overlock from there down to the bottom of the hem if you're using the straight one, and then across the bottom if you're using the straight version, and up the other side past the notch again if you're sewing the straight version. For the curve version, we're simply going to start above this notch, overlock around the curve all the way to the same position on the other side seam. So here we are approaching the notch on the other side. Just go up around about 5 centimeters, 2 inches, and then overlock off. Now come to the opening for the arm on the other side and secure that. Right, put the back somewhere safe and do exactly the same thing to the front piece. Make sure you have the front right side up. Now what I'd like you to do, because it's easier to do it now before the pieces are sewn together, is to go to your iron and turn the sleeves at the notch, so the notch is at 2 centimeters, which is 3/4 of an inch, and press the sleeves into place. So that will just help make sure our overlocking is going to sit nice and flat too. So just go ahead and press those to the wrong side so the pieces are separate. And at the hemline where we've overlocked, on the curve version the hem is 1/2 centimetre or near enough to 1/4 of an inch. So what that means is the hem is probably the width of your overlocking. If you make the hem any more, you might find you aren't able to do that curve properly. You'll get roping. So all you're going to do is just turn this over the width of the overlocking and press that into place to help set in those overlocking stitches before we go ahead and sew it. So now we're going to sew the shoulders together. So place the back right side up and the front right side down. And match the shoulder position. Okay, so I'm going to start on the right hand side as if you're wearing it, and I'm going to open up where I've just pressed and match those overlocked edges. So we're going to be sewing at 1 centimetre seam allowance from the armhole across to the neckline. So make sure you back tack, and remember 1 centimetre is 3/8 of an inch. And back tack at the end. Okay, so come across to the other side and match that point there and do exactly the same thing but in reverse. Okay, so now go to your overlocker and tidy up this raw edge here. So now we're going to look at finishing the neckline. the first thing you need to do is take your binding piece, which is cut on the bias to give it flexibility, and place it right sides together, and we're going to sew a 1 centimeter seam on the short ends. Make sure you back tack at the beginning and end. Okay, so open this out and fold it again so we have wrong sides together. Now just a small note before you go any further. This is cut to be 3 centimeters, which is 1 3/16 of an inch wide. When you're working with a really light fabric like chiffon, I did try and use my roller cutter, but clearly I need a new blade. It can adjust in width quite a lot, so you may need to add extra width to this. So you may need to add an 1/8 of an inch to one side. You may need to add 1/4 of an inch in total. It really depends on how flexible your material is, your fabric is. I can tell right now by looking at this that I should have made this a little bit extra wide, but we'll go ahead. So what we're going to do now is we need to press this in half. So with wrong sides together, press this in half like so. So the neck finish we're using today is called an internal binding. Basically it's the same as if you sewed bias binding to the neckline, then turned it to the inside so it was hidden and stitched. Right, so what we have here, now I've pressed this, is a seam. So in a perfect world that would be nice and straight. We can manipulate it as we go. The seam is the centre back. If we folded this in half like so, directly opposite you will find a notch. That notch is the centre front, and then part way between the two you will have another notch which will match to the shoulders. So what we need to do is take our garment, and I'm going to start at the centre back. So what I'm doing is placing my back right side up, and I'm finding the double notches at the neckline. So the garment is right side up. So either way if the binding is right side up, it makes no difference. Match the seam you had here to the center of the double notch. So I'm matching the center of the seam to the center of the notches, and I'm going to start sewing just one side of it, and I'm going to back tack to reduce bulk. Just make sure the tape is on this side of the foot or you'll end up having to stop and start again. Right, so start by stitching a couple of stitches and back tack it. And in a perfect world there'll be around about a millimetre, well actually 2 millimeters on this side of the foot. So that's 2 millimeters is just shy of an 1/8 of an inch. So once you've got a couple of stitches underway, just to help secure that in place, I'll just help hold it. Find the first notch, and that notch needs to match to the shoulder seam, and it's a good idea to pin that into place. Now the bias tape is stretchy, that's its job. Of course you could always buy pre-made bias tape if you're not comfortable doing this. So just match that edge and continue stitching until you get to just short of your pin. Now to help keep this even, you can always eyeball the right hand side of your presser foot. So now we're sewing the V-neck version. The V-neck is finished with a bias binding trim that you will see from the right side of the garment. And to sew this bias binding into place, we only sew one shoulder together. So let's start by sewing the right shoulder as you're wearing it together. So we're going to sew from the armhole edge here across to the neckline. Now don't worry about the fact that I've overlocked the back piece. This is just a test garment and I was playing around with the construction sequence. So all you need to do is match the shoulder and sew with a 1 centimetre seam, which is 3/8 of an inch. And remember to backpack that. Now go ahead and overlock finish this edge here. Right, so there's the edge overlocked, and we're now going to open this up. And we want to start sewing so that it is right side up. Right, so the first place we're going to start attaching our binding is through the back, and you can see the back here, and there's 2 small notches which indicate the that it is the back. It's the scoop side, so the scoop's on the back and the V's on the front. So we're going to start from this edge here. Now in a perfect world there's no need to put notches on the garment when we're attaching bias binding. So I've attached a bias binding, I've made a bias binding piece that's in the pattern that you can use if you're going to do a bias binding manually. If you're going to use pre-bought bias tape, just mark the notches on that tape when you cut it, and the notches will match the shoulder, the centre back position, which is in the middle of the 2 notches, the shoulder on the other side, then it'll match the centre of the V, and then back to the shoulder on the other side. If you have a bias binding attachment for your machine, and a lot of home sewing machines do, I'm going to show you how to do it with a binding attachment, and how we make the V with that. So here is my binder installed on my machine, and whether you have a commercial machine or a home sewing machine, they're pretty much the same, and even the ones you buy for a cover stitch are pretty much the same. So my favourite width for this is 30mm, which is 3 centimetres or 1/3/16 of an inch. It's a pretty good size. They pretty much are all the same idea. The bias tape gets fed through here. When we set it up, we want to make sure the wrong side of the fabric is facing you, but that will really depend on your binder type. And all you do is, it's a good idea if there's an angle to start with, is feed it through here, and either with a small screwdriver or even long nose tweezers that come with your machine, you just push the fabric through till it comes out here, and you can tell I've gone in and out here, and it will come out this way. So lift up your foot like so, pull this through, and it will start to double fold it through. Once you've started it off, just start stitching until you can see that both sides have folded through. Now if you do have a double fold binder, what you do is you cut out the pattern piece I've given you the same width but make it extra long. If you have a different size binder, make sure you cut the width to suit. So you just need the extra length because of the tail that's sometimes formed, to make sure you get a good bind when you start. You'll always lose fabric, so you can't cut it the perfect length and expect it to work. Right, so what we do once you have your binder installed is take your garment neckline and we'll start sewing it. So I'm going to feed the shoulder here, which is the left hand side as if I'm wearing it, in, and I'm just going to start stitching. So if you have cut double notches for the back, make sure you don't cut them too deep, because we want the binding to hide it. When we reach the shoulder seam, you may have a tail. Trim any of that bulk off and just make sure that that seam's facing the back and that you've got a nice smooth transition around. Continue down. And here is our V, and now that little notch that you put for the centre front will just help straighten this out. We want to try and make as straight a line as we can. We don't want any bunching around the centre front neck. And then just continue stitching all the way off to the shoulder. So if you are stitching this by hand, just stitch on the bias binding in the normal way and then go ahead and we'll complete the other shoulder. So as you can see, the binder gives a really nice finish to the edge. You can of course do this with the round neck version as well. Really the only difference with the round neck version is, let me show you, once you've stitched the binding on, then what we can do is turn it to the inside and do an internal bind like that. So that's a really easy way of doing an internal bind too if you have this attachment, but if you've got this attachment you could just as easily leave your scoop neck with a binding around it. Alright, so let's sew the shoulder together. So what we're going to do is come to the shoulder and place the ends of the shoulder binding edge right sides together. Now it's a good idea to sew this from the neckline edge to the sleeve, and we're sewing with a 1 centimetre seam, and we want to sew it from the neckline edge just to give a really nice finish. So just match that shoulder together. And sew at 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch. So back tack the beginning and end of that, and when you've finished, go ahead and overlock that. So here is the seam finished. So trim the neckline edge serging thread back to 1 inch, which is around about 2.5 centimetres. What we're going to do now is roll this to the inside here, and you can either just stitch that up, but what we're going to do now is push the whole seam towards the back like that. So this is the back and this is the front, and then we're going to turn it to the right side and just right on the stitching line for the bias, just back tack a couple of times. So forwards 3, back 3, and that will kill 2 birds with 1 stone. It will hide your overlocking thread within the seam allowance, and we'll also make sure that that shoulder seam sits nicely towards the back of the garments. This is the back, this is the front, and it will give us a lovely smooth transition at the shoulder edge. So the last thing we have to do now is stitch in the V of the V-neck. So at the neckline, match the seams of the shoulders like so. So that's the centre back. Here's our shoulders, and then come down and match the tape towards the front. So that will give you the position of the centre front. What I'm going to do is just pop a little pin in it like this. Before you go any further, just double check that that is absolutely correct. So if we place this like so, you will see the centre front runs down and the bias tape sits over. We basically have to stitch in a direct line up, so we want to just basically remove this triangle here with our stitching. All we're going to do And I'll just pop that pin a little bit further away to make it easier for you to see. So what we're going to do is come in, now it's around about 4 mil, so it's 4 mil is like just over 1/8 of an inch from the top edge, and we want to stitch like that on the line of my pin. So we're just going to stitch from this folded edge here. We're going to stop at the stitching line on our bias tape here. I'm going to create a little triangle at the edge. Make sure that top folded edge is nice and sitting on top of each other, and it really is only a couple of stitches. So a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches back, and when you stop, make sure you stop in the middle before you cut your thread. We don't want the threads sticking up or sticking down. We want them, any stray threads, just to be right in the middle. And what that does is it gives us a beautiful V for our V-neck. So we're going to continue down on a 1 centimetre seam, tapering off to 6 mil, which is just at the edge of the overlocking, and stop directly opposite the notch in the side seam. So we're tapering from 3/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch, and then we're going to stop and back tack just opposite the notch here. Now we're going to move to our overlocker and overlock to secure that edge. So when you come to the starting of the overlocking, just overlock, taper your overlocking off. So now we're going to do the hems on the sleeves. So trim your overlocking thread back to around about 1 inch, 2.5 centimetres, and tuck that through We're going to enclose that when we sew it. So our notch will be under our overlocking here, and we've pressed so it's easy to see where we're going. And I suggest you start sewing this from the underarm seam. It'll just hide any stitches, and all we're going to do is sew this directly through our overlocking line, remembering to back tack at the beginning and the end. Okay, so go ahead and repeat that on the other sleeve. Right, so go ahead and do some quality control work, just trim some stray threads, and we're going to work on the body of the garment hemline. Right, so come to one of the side seams, and the first thing I want to do is tidy up this overlocking cord. So all I'm going to do is fold it back on itself, up the seam, and I'm going to sew a couple of stitches forwards and back, just to hold that down. Right, so now we're going to sew the curve version. If you're doing the straight hem version, I'll explain that as we go. So the first thing we want to do, we want this side seam here to be open like that. So finger press that into place if you need to. Right, and I'm going to sew this from the right side. I know I normally sew them from the wrong side, but I can see through this quite nicely. Come to the top where it joins, or where it splits here, and if you're doing the curve version, come up 6mm, 1/4 inch, and put a small back tack in to start. And we're also, I'm going to sew the curve version 1/4 inch, 6mm. You want to be stitching through this overlocking line on the edge. You might need to adjust it. Right, so when we come up to this other side, make sure that seam is open again, and we'll deal with that overlocking in a minute. So make sure that's open, and because I'm doing the curve version, I'm going to go up past this 6mm, 1/4 inch, and I'm going to stop with the needle down. I'm going to lift, turn and pivot. So you will be doing this with the straight hem version 1 centimetre up. Stitch across, stop with the needle down, lift, turn and pivot, and go all the way back to the beginning on the other side. If you get tunnelling or roping, it's because your seam allowance is too wide. Now, if you really hate the idea of doing this, you could always put bias binding tape around this bottom edge. So go up to 6mm, 1/4 inch past again, lift, turn and pivot, back stitch directly across back to your original stitch line, and I'm going to lift, turn and pivot and back tack here, so forward 3, back 3. So all I'm doing is I just want to make sure there's a nice transition at the side. And because I forgot to earlier, I'm just going to get this overlocking thread on the other side up, twist it up into the side seam and stitch it down. And then trim off these little stray threads, which is a little bit of fraying and some of that. Alright. So now I'm going to show you how to do the hem area on the straight hem version. So come to one of the side seam positions, and here's the bottom of the split here. So it doesn't matter whether you start at the back or the front, just whichever you find easier. So this is the back and this is the front, and I know that because the back's longer. Come to the hemline, and remember that we've pressed these and we're going to be sewing at 1 centimetre. So if you haven't already, go to your iron and press the bottom and the side splits 1 centimetre, 3/8 inch. Start with a small back tack and stitch up to hold that 1 centimetre side split position in place. Basically we're just going to be sewing through the overlocking, and if you find it easier you could sew it from the back. When you get to the split position, make sure that that seam is still pressed open, so it's pressed like that underneath, and we're going to go 1 centimetre past the top of the split, so 3/8 inch past the top of the split. Stop with the needle down in your work. We're going to lift, turn and pivot around. So we're going to be sewing at the right angle to the first seam, so make sure it's all nice like that, and then stitch across to 1 centimetre past the seam. Stop with your needle down, lift, turn and pivot. Make sure you have caught the overlocking and continue stitching down through the overlocking line. So that's what we're looking for. We want to create the stitching up, across and down, and then just go ahead and repeat that on the other side. When you've done that, to finish off, all we need to do now is fold. Well, first thing we need to do is trim back any overlocking threads to around about 1 inch, which is 2.5 centimetres. Tuck that overlocking in, and then turn the bottom hem up by 1 centimetre. And remembering to back tack to start, we're going to sew from side to side. And when you've done that hem, go ahead and repeat the hem on the other side. And when you're finished, don't forget to go to your iron and give your seams your hems a really good press. It will just help embed those stitches and give a really lovely finish. Okay, so come back to the front channel, take your loop turner, or put a safety pin through, or whatever you want to do. Attach that to your drawstring, So we want to make sure we don't have this twisted for a start, but pull it part way through so the elastic's hidden in the middle. Now this part is entirely up to you, but I'm going to give you some suggested amounts to stitch this down. First things first, we want this underneath the machine foot, one layer only, so get that bottom layer out of it. I mean, you might find it easier to do this at an earlier stage. I always like to do it last. So pull this through. Okay, so pull your draw cord through on one side till you can see where the elastic has joined in. Measure out 3 centimeters from the end. Place a pin. Draw that back until the pin is touching the edge here. Then making sure that this drawstring's in the center, edge stitched down, making sure you're on one layer only, you don't have any of the back of the garment cord, and back tack at the beginning and the end. Come to the other side, do the same thing, making sure your draw cord hasn't twisted. Find the end of it. Measure out 3 centimeters, which is close enough to 1 1¼ inches. Well, sorry, it's 3 centimeters, 1 3/16 of an inch. Let's be correct about that. So bring that back. Pop that in the center. Making sure you've only got the front layer caught. Edge stitch that into place. So this will give you, doing it this way will give you a permanently ruffled front with just a couple of draw cords. I mean, you could tie them in the front if you wanted a bit of an effect, or just leave them there for design effect. So now we need to do the top stitching to create the armhole. Well, it's really to shorten the armhole, and it will help just create a bit of a drape effect. So come to the drill hole position, so that will be a little mark here. So right side up, front, so right side out, front at the front, back at the back, and if it helps you might need to press the side seam into place. Find the drill hole, either side, it doesn't matter, and come to 1 centimeter, which is 3/8 of an inch above it. And we need to line this up because we're going to sew in a direct line from there right through to the edge of the side seam. So start by back tacking to secure. Then we're going to imagine a straight line. So you have to imagine a straight line from where you're going to stitch directly to the side seam, and that's exactly where we're going to stitch to. When you get to that area, back tack to secure. And that's that side done. And come to the other side, find the drill hole. Now the front and the back drill holes should be exactly on top of each other. So if you match everything, they should be fine. So find that drill hole, come to 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch above it, back tack. And bear in mind when we sew this, we want to sew directly through the drill hole. Then imagine that straight line again there, down to the edge of the side seam, and just adjust your angle appropriately and stitch down. Now certainly this is one step you can skip if you really feel you need to. And so that's it, our garment is finished. If you want to, as I said, you could buy some end caps for this or put an applique on the front of the garment. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for joining me with this sew-along, and thanks for buying the pattern. And don't forget to join my Facebook pattern discussion groups where you can get in contact with me directly and ask me questions if you need to. So thanks very much. Hope to see you again soon.